Today, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about kind of some thoughts I've been having recently around how security is approaching the concept of cloud and DevOps security, and how we as an industry have developed a little bit of myopia around our perspective on it. And I'd like to do that today by first going back in time a little bit and trying to prove a few points around how new or not new this technology actually is. And to do that, I'm going to do the annoying keynote thing where I ask the audience a bunch of questions, and I would love for you guys to answer, even if you think it might make you look stupid. There are no stupid answers here. So with that, I'd love to start things off by talking about the most important thing on the stage in front of you, and that is me, of course, and tell you a little bit about my background. So I started off my career in security in 2005 after finishing a master's degree in information assurance from the prestigious Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Is anybody here from Iowa? There's always a few great people from Iowa, right? It's a small network of like underground Iowa security people. After graduating, I started working within the Motorola Security Operations Center, and this is old school war game style, like maps on theater in front of a auditorium style operations center, where we were monitoring the networks of both Motorola, and this is prime. Anybody remember the Razor phone era Motorola? 120,000 employees. That has unfortunately changed in the past 10 years, but what hasn't changed? I moved into consulting, and at Motorola, the key is to work for other customers of Motorola, and we would do lots of penetration tests and application assessments for them. And I'm going to say, if anybody in the audience here who happens to work for a cellular provider, our bread and butter service was actually to take a cell phone and to go to a cellular provider, usually abroad in Europe or something like that, and do a penetration test. And the secret was that if you had a data SIM and you were connected to an operator, they were not doing segmentation very well, and more often than not, you're actually dropped onto their corporate network from your cell phone. And this is without any nefarious activity or anything like that. You could do network scans or anything, and you would just find lots of fun internal things all over the place. And we did that for a number of years before I moved to a boutique consulting company called Neo-Hapsis, which is one of the older security consulting companies out there, but it has since been acquired by Cisco a couple years ago. But I continued my work doing penetration testing and application assessments, and this is based out of the Chicago area. So anybody from Chicago? That crowd-pleasing, like, is there anybody from Colorado here? Clap your hands. Love Chicago, spent a lot of time there, and it actually led to one of the more interesting opportunities I had in my career. Chicago has a relatively small technology scene, and if you know one person, you end up knowing a lot of that scene. And I was having dinner one day with some friends in technology, not in security, and was chatting with a friend of mine who recently got tapped to take on the role of Chief Technology Officer for the Barack Obama re-election campaign in 2012. And Obama being from Chicago, the headquarters was in Chicago. So a lot of the local talent was being tapped to take on technology challenges there. And I was chatting with my friend, and we were talking about the work they were doing on the campaign, and he told me that, you know, he's having trouble sleeping because he's worried that all of these wonderful things they're building and this really important mission of re-electing a president could be tossed to the side if there's a security incident. And this was 2011, 2012. This is prime, like lulzsec, anonymous kind of days when all of those headlines were being pushed down into papers about breaches and information being publicized. And the concern was really that this good work could be derailed by a security incident. So after talking with him a little bit, I told him that, you know, if they can find a role for me, I think that's something I could help him out with. And within a month or two, I had quit my job consulting and joined up as probably the first full-time security role on a political campaign in the US, and I spent about a year and a half working full-time on this campaign. An incredible experience. You get to do a lot of things you normally don't get to play with on a day-to-day basis. You get to meet Secret Service agents every day. You get to work with incredibly sensitive information, and from a security perspective, it's a really rich environment. I think that's only been proven more so with recent events that have occurred in the last election cycle. But that was really my first opportunity to play around with DevOps as well. So the 2012 campaign was almost entirely in Amazon, so much so that after the campaign was finished, we were invited to give a talk at the first reInvent conference that Amazon held in 2012. The other great thing about working on a campaign is that you know exactly the day you're going to be fired, and that is roughly 2 weeks after Election Day. So most of us were taking like a well-deserved break. We went to Las Vegas to participate in this conference and to talk about the work we were doing in Amazon. And I think very few things are more aptly suited for a cloud environment than a political campaign, actually, and that's mostly around scalability. So you start with a very small organization with a very small amount of money, but you need to scale up to something that is truly national within the space of about a year and a half. And that's a very, very unique challenge and something that is uniquely situated to public cloud environments. So I got to play around with DevOps ideas and principles for the first time. I got to play around in public cloud environments for the first time. And I really wanted to continue that kind of work after the campaign. So at reInvent, one of the other headliners there was actually Netflix, and they were talking about their use case in Amazon's cloud. And it came that a lot of the campaign people ended up having dinner with a lot of the Netflix people. And I will never forget the evening when a very James Bond-esque villain was at the dinner table with me, was chatting around with all of the Obama technology people, and he came over behind me, tapped me on the shoulder, and in a very thick Russian accent, he was like, "Ben, your coworker tells me that you're the best security engineer in the world." And I'm like, I don't know, I think I'm pretty good. I don't know if I'm the best. He's like, "It just so happens that I have been tapped to find and hire the best security engineer in the world." And he's like, "I will get you in touch with our head of security." And a week later, I had a phone call with Jason Chan over there. And he conned me into going to work at Netflix for about 4 years. I moved from Chicago to the West Coast and had a wonderful experience there, playing around in cloud environments and coming up with some interesting solutions for cloud security controls. It was a wonderful job, but all things come to an end, and I decided to move on and joined up with Salesforce, leading their information assurance or infrastructure assurance team, and focused on trying to get them from their bare metal deployments and data centers into the public cloud. I then left there and joined up with Facebook and became head of corporate security there. Much different, but still interesting challenges to take on. Part of my organization was also the red team and also manufacturing security. So if you've ever played around with those Oculus Rift headsets, my team was responsible for making sure that those do not blow your face off when you put them on. And that has never happened yet. So lots of interesting stuff. I left Facebook a couple months ago and have been enjoying some time off, but also helping out with some of these SANS events, and it's been a great experience for me. So with that being said, I'd like to move on to an even more important topic. And here I'd love to get a sense from the audience on your perspective of things. So let's start with something that everybody is familiar with. And of course, that is frozen pizza. Who can tell me when the first commercially successful frozen pizza came out in the United States? Yes, Jason Chan. Not 1980, before that actually, well before that. Any other guesses? 1951, closer. So it is generally accepted that the first frozen pizza, successful one, came out in 62. Although there were frozen pizzas, they just weren't large scale. And the company, without cheating, sir, that released this pizza, it is still around today. It is available in any frozen food section. But what company really came out with the frozen pizza? Who was the cutting-edge innovator that came out with frozen pizza? Not Red Baron, but I mean, it's in that category of pizza. Anybody else? It's actually, so Tombstone and Totino's is actually the generally accepted first frozen pizza out there in 1962. Tombstone came out in the same year, actually. And it's debatable whether they're copycatting or it was independent innovation occurring. But basically, we didn't have frozen pizza before 1962. And pizza itself wasn't very popular until frozen pizza came around. So other important dates in pizza history, 1958, that is when Pizza Hut opened for the first time. Little Caesars, the Detroit chain, started in 1959. And then Domino's didn't get around until 1967. So more than likely, all of our grandparents grew up without pizza, which is really interesting. And I think we can kind of apply some of that understanding to the world of technology as well. So AWS, we all know that is Amazon Web Services. Without cheating again, who knows what the first service released by AWS was? We all know there are great things out there. Not S3, actually. Close. Not EC2. The actual first service was SQS, was their first one. And anybody know what year that was released? If you had to guess, what would you think? 2005? Very close. It was 2004. So the first Amazon service came out in 2004. Things were revamped in 2006, and that's when they released S3 and EC2, joining SQS as one of the premier services there. And of course, things didn't really take off until EC2 joined the fray. We've got two more of these, and the point here is just to help you understand that these aren't necessarily new technologies. They've been around for over 10 years at this point, and we as a security industry approach them as kind of novel things, right? But they've actually been around a long time. Who knows what this is? Jenkins, right? As a penetration tester, we always thought it was a jackpot when we found a Jenkins instance on a network because, one, it's hard to secure, but also nobody actually does bother to try and secure it. So once you hit a Jenkins box, you've kind of owned the entire environment. Who knows when Jenkins came out for the first time? If you had to guess, right? Based on your personal experience, when do you think Jenkins came out? Not quite that old, but it started at an oldie but goodie technology company called Sun Microsystems. And that makes sense with Java and everything. But it started as a project called Hudson in 2004, and then was forked. It was open source as Hudson. It was forked into Jenkins in 2011. But the fundamental kind of premise here is that it's been out since 2004. I probably didn't run into it until the first time on the Obama campaign in 2011. So it had been around a good time at that point, and it's been around even longer now. The last one up here, C groups. So who knows what a C group is? I like the wavy hand answer is probably right, because it's a lot of things, but this is the basic and fundamental technology behind things like Docker, so containerization. This is a kernel feature that was added into Linux that enables you to kind of load share things like processes and memory and network and I/O on your disk, and to do things like containerization with pretty strong segmentation. You can probably guess what the question is, but when did C groups get added to the Linux kernel? How many years ago? This is Docker, right? This is cutting edge stuff. Like the squinty-eyed thinking on everybody's face. Any guess? 5 years ago? No. So it was actually added in 2007. So we've had concepts around containerization within Linux kernels for over 10 years now. And of course, they've only really taken off with, I would say, Docker, Kubernetes, that kind of thing. And it was actually started and added to the kernel by engineers at Google. So for that long, they've been working on the concept of containerization, not a new concept again, and something that's been around long enough that there's probably some good technology there, right? It's an oldie but goodie, but has taken on a new life with kind of modern principles of DevOps. And that gets us to DevOps. So in thinking of what I wanted to talk about today, it brought me into that retrospective feeling of trying to understand what exactly DevOps was, right? And one of the main problems we have here is that there's kind of a glossary problem. Because people talk about DevOps, and then DevOps wasn't cool anymore. It was one of those words that became a noun, a verb, and an adjective. You could say, we need more DevOps at this company. Or you could say, that's not a very DevOps-y principle you're dealing with there. Or you got to DevOps the hell out of that. And I think people would understand what you're talking about generally. But then new and shinier things happened. We had NoOps, right? And NoOps is kind of like DevOps, but a little more explicitly not having an operations team. I think they're just trying to reinforce the lack of a dedicated team here. We have platform as a service, which I would say is kind of the evolution of infrastructure as a service. The goal is building the foundation on which people release software. And this is kind of in line with the paved road principles we heard from Jason yesterday. And then, of course, most recently, we have serverless, which is micro functions. And despite the next slide, I'm actually a huge fan of serverless, but I also think it's the most hipster of all technologies in that it is genuinely, right, a microservice-oriented container-based platform as a service supporting NoOps principles. It also has continuous integration and deployment and infrastructure as code as core concepts there. So if you want the latest and hottest and most hipster, serverless is where it's at. And I think it actually does have great potential, and it's a great tool to have within your security belt. We saw some great presentations on it yesterday. From a security perspective, right, it's really shifting security up the layer. You need to be more concerned about application security than anything else at that point. But really interesting challenges there. And when you think about a keynote presentation and you think about new concepts like DevOps, you have to think about a rote dictionary definition that somebody reads you from stage. So I went to that most trusted of all sources on the internet, that one place where you look for core knowledge and core definitions of things. And I'm talking about, of course, Webopedia, the truth of the internet, as I like to call it. And they have a really interesting definition here, actually, and I'm going to rotely read it to you. DevOps is an enterprise software development phrase used to mean a type of agile relationship, and I like the subtle dig at agile there, between development and IT operations. The goal of DevOps is to change and improve the relationship by advocating better communication and collaboration between those two business units. What do you think? Does this sound like a good definition of DevOps? It doesn't mention any technologies. It doesn't mention any of those hipster services we're talking about. But fundamentally, it's kind of interesting, right? It's more of a communication strategy than it is technology or capability. And I think that's a really interesting lens with which to look at things from. At the same time, one of my favorite quotes, and I could not attribute this to anybody, but I've heard it many times, so somebody must have said it originally, is that DevOps is just what ops was doing all along, as long as they were good operations people. And I think you can kind of say that about security too, and the kind of logic chain that I'm trying to bring us down is that as security professionals, we can actually leverage a lot of what we already know to make good decisions within a DevOps world. It really just requires understanding the fundamentals and finding interesting ways to apply them. So in talking about security and DevOps, we've also come out with a glossary of terms, right? We have SecDevOps, which is a pretty good decision to just put security in front of DevOps, and you get a great team name there. Some people want to emphasize the dev side, and they do DevSecOps, which I wonder if there's actually a difference between these two concepts. Probably not. From out of the blue, we have the trademarked term rugged DevOps. Has anybody heard this before? And I think they're trying to differentiate by saying they want to build security into their continuous integration and deployment pipeline. Good intention, but I think it's just kind of muddying the water in terms of understanding what security and DevOps means. And then we have good old SecOps, right? The team at Netflix was called SecOps. It's an homage, I'd like to think, to traditional security operations, but just applying it within a cloud environment. But the question then becomes, right, if these are the security teams, who's watching the watchers? And I think we deserve an entirely new term for that, and I would propose it is the rugged SecDevSecOps OPSEC team, and their purpose being to just watch these security teams and make sure they're doing the right things. So I would encourage you all to go back to your managers and seek funding to start one of these teams. It'll look great on a business card, I think. And I think we can also actually go back to that original definition of DevOps, which trusty old Webopedia identified for us. And I think with just a few subtle replacements, we actually have a great definition for security here too. Because I think security, the unappreciated underlying skill set that makes security successful, right, is communication. And it's being a good connector between teams and helping them understand how to leverage technology well and helping them to do it responsibly. So I think that definition from Webopedia, which, to be honest, I thought pretty naively was not a great definition, I think it actually works out pretty well. And I think it has a few things to teach us about security within a DevOps world as well. So this will be the final question that I ask the audience today, but hopefully it'll lead to something interesting. But I wonder, what is the most recent and serious cloud-related or DevOps-related breach that you can think of? Anybody got one that's top of mind? I recommend you do not choose the employer that you're working with right now. Anybody have something that's top of mind? Facebook, Wells Fargo. I would say the Facebook one is probably a more direct application security vulnerability, but they certainly have a very complicated environment. Experian, a lot of the more recent breaches had some play within the DevOps world, I think. But from personal experience, I think from my perspective, the most serious cloud-related breach was something I had the opportunity to take part in. Because of my work on the Obama campaign, I was connected with a kind of motley group of Democratic technologists who are working on different campaigns throughout the country. And just as the campaign for Hillary Clinton was spinning up, I started chatting with them on how they can improve security, what they can think about as kind of the risks of running a campaign, what my experience was like in 2012, and help them figure out how to do security within their campaign. I helped them find a couple people to work on security. They actually had 2 full-time security people by the end of the campaign. And I helped them off and on throughout the duration of it. But it became much more interesting when I received a phone call. I was, and this is very memorable to me, I was actually at another Amazon event in DC, and I was at Reagan Airport about to fly home when I got a phone call from one of my friends at the Hillary campaign, and it opened with kind of the most dreaded possible opening you get as a security professional, and it was, hey Ben, can you join a secure line right now? And I was like, I'm in an airport, I look for like the quietest corner, and I called them back. And what began to unfold is what became known as the DNC breach that occurred, perpetrated by Russian intelligence teams. And in talking to them, fascinating for one thing, and kind of an interesting opportunity to work on some of that kind of newsworthy security event, what I knew of, and has only recently become kind of public knowledge, was released within an indictment of 12 Russians recently. And that is actually that part of this breach, and the interesting part here is the reference to third-party cloud computing services. Part of this is actually the nightmare scenario that a lot of us are probably trying to protect against. Basically, the public cloud presence at the DNC was compromised as part of this breach, and the adversaries used their access that was taken from a developer's machine to connect to the third-party cloud computing service, which is not mentioned explicitly, but I'm sure you can guess what it is. And they were able to enumerate a lot of things in there, and they were able to exfiltrate that data in what is probably the most frightening way possible, and something that is uniquely enabled in cloud environments by just copying objects from one account to another. You're not necessarily even abiding by rules of speed of light there, because you're just sometimes copying references to objects. And you're able to exfiltrate terabytes of data within a couple minutes. And you can take it through a chain of accounts. You can download it locally whenever you have time. This entire attack took place over a couple hours, basically. And that is incredibly scary, and it's incredibly, I think, motivating as a security professional to understand that your adversaries have this level of technical expertise available to them. The ability to enumerate and steal information from your Amazon account if you just make one single mistake and somehow get them access to it. So I was able to work with them on some incident response, and actually we found a great organization of volunteers within mostly the Bay Area who took quite a lot of time out of their schedules to go work with the DNC directly. They rented a house, and it was kind of like a college frat house environment of people like working late at night trying to rebuild these kind of networks, meanwhile doing incident response. I was able to take advantage of Netflix's generous time off policy and a very understanding manager to go and spend the last couple weeks with the Hillary campaign, helping them recover from some of these events, but also helping them bolster their security and improve their monitoring. I was in New York on election night, and I attended the rally for Hillary Clinton on election night, and it was an incredibly sad personal day when the election results were announced. But nonetheless, it was incredibly gratifying to have the opportunity to work on something so historic. So with that being said, for the rest of the talk, I'd really like to refer back to what we were calling the top 10 risks in cloud computing, and this is something we came out with at another SANS summit called the Cloud Insecurity Summit that we held a couple months ago. And these are really risks that we worked with a variety of industry practitioners to come up with. These are people from Netflix, from Lyft, from Riot Games, and from Harvard University. We collaborated to come up with this top 10 list. And I'd really like to go through these, but more from the viewpoint of them perhaps not being so interesting and perhaps not being so novel, because it's actually just good old fundamental security when you think about it. So these top 10 risks, again, were kind of a collaboration across several individuals. And they're meant to just highlight what some of the common vulnerabilities in cloud computing are, and I think there's a lot of overlap here with the general concepts around DevOps. But to get into them, the first one we had was the insecure use of developer credentials, and this has always been a problem, right? If you ever have secrets, you need to protect those secrets. So secure storage of secrets and responsibly using them continues to be a problem, but perhaps is a little more interesting now because of the risk of somebody breaking into your account and getting access to your entire data center all at once. Or perhaps having, basically you just have a bigger bucket to pull from, right? If you're able to get Amazon credentials or something commensurate with that. The second one on this list is publicly accessible S3 buckets. And this is actually very reminiscent to me of, who remembers anonymous FTP sites? And like that's always been a problem in security, right? Somebody always wanted to put up an anonymous FTP site. They always had to like send some big files over to a partner or something. And there's always been a use case for this kind of activity. And I would say it's always been a problem within security that we've been trying to solve. Only now, we have it as a managed service by Amazon. But is it really any different than the good old anonymous FTP problems we had? Maybe in a few subtle ways, but I think overall the risk is kind of the same there. Third on the list is the improper use of default configurations, and I actually think this is one of the more unique ones. And this is probably not the most intuitive risk that we talk about, but if you think about it, and you're using IAM within Amazon, you can use a managed policy from them, which is basically a preset collection of rights that they think is going to be useful to people. So some common ones are like administrative access to the account, read-only access to the account, database user of the account, and they pre-populate this with access rights they think you're going to use. The problem here is actually that those change while you're using them, and they don't ask you if you want them to change, they just changed because they're managed by Amazon. And if you are following principles of least privilege, you've probably eliminated entire classes of services from your users' access rights. And the problem here is that if it's a managed policy, Amazon will add new services to it without you knowing. So they release something new and shiny, maybe a new database technology or a new security service, and anybody who has that right can suddenly play with it and turn it on, and you have not actually explicitly given them that access. And you've not been asked whether you want that to, be handed out to them. So the improper use of default credentials only exists because we're using a shared resource here that has some defaults provided for us. An interesting problem. Number 4, access controls do not follow least privilege. This is straight out of whatever security book you read and got into the industry with. The goal here being to give people exactly the rights they need, but nothing more. Your application or your individual should only have access to what they need to do their job, but you shouldn't have more than that. And that's deceptively hard to do within cloud environments, right? We heard some great kind of tools to accomplish that being worked on by Netflix, which uses log data to profile and to restrict a set of controls down to what is actually being used in a practical sense, which is great. But the concept of least privilege has been around forever. And we simply need to think about ways to apply it within cloud environments. Number 5 is misconfigured network constructs. And again, like who hasn't dealt with firewall rules within their career? Who hasn't dealt with like BGP and other fun routing principles? The same kind of problems can exist within your cloud environments, and they just require you to architect your network in ways that accomplish your security goals. In general, though, I think within Amazon, we have security groups, we have route tables, we have a few other principles we can look at. I would argue that we're actually in a better place with these, just because we can inventory them very easily and understand what's out there. But it doesn't become anything more complicated than having a good network security architecture. And not that that isn't complicated, but it's nothing new. Number 6, lack of appropriate logging and monitoring. We heard all the great things that Amazon does for you. They have CloudTrail, they have a number of other technologies. Your CI/CD pipelines have very interesting logs, but we don't necessarily go through the trouble of actually being able to leverage them in a timely manner. We don't go through the trouble of centralizing them sometimes. And certainly, we don't do a great job with inventory around who is actually making log statements, right? Because I think the great potential of Amazon is that we have APIs to collect all this information, But we need to do extra work to actually enrich that with information around what is actually being processed and what the risk associated with a log entry is. And that requires some deliberate changes to how we do logging. But again, we've had SIMs for who knows how many years. So at Motorola, I used like early versions of ArcSight, which will haunt me for the rest of my life. But logging has always been a problem, and centralizing logs has always been a challenge for companies. We have a whole new set of them now, but I think fundamentally, it's not a very different challenge. The last 4 on the list here, lack of inventory management. This is, again, speaking towards the need to understand inventory, not just have it. I think it's a lot easier to do the fundamentals of inventory now that we're in cloud environments, but it doesn't mean we're putting it to its full use or full potential. Domain hijacking is a relatively new risk, I think. This is actually one of the novel ones. And the idea here is that several Amazon services and several other SaaS providers, there's a transitive trust implied with domain ownership. And if you stop using a service, but you don't get rid of the domain, somebody can often take that over, sign up for the same service, say they have the domain, and because you have it pre-configured, it opens the door for that domain to be taken over and for them to deploy something there. It's a relatively new problem, but domain security has been a topic of security conversation for many, many years now. 9 and 10 are, again, fundamentals, so lack of a disaster recovery plan. I know a lot of us look at public cloud technologies as being robust and being something that is resilient to disaster because of multiple geographic locations, because of the time, thought, and energy that has been put into this by Amazon. But in fact, we're still vulnerable to kind of a devastating attack here. If somebody were to get access to your account and delete it, how are you going to recover from that kind of scenario? I don't think a lot of companies have actually put a ton of time into thinking about what does offsite storage look like for a cloud environment. And that's an interesting problem, but it's nothing new. We've always thought about disaster recovery, and I think the principles of that will serve us well within cloud environments as well. Finally on the list, we have manual account configuration. And this was a lesson I learned very early on in my career. And it's one that I will share with you all now. I'm a fundamentally lazy person. And I like working with lazy people just because I'll do something once or twice, but come 3 or 4 times, I'm looking for an opportunity to script it or automate it away. And I think we have a lot of unfortunate vulnerabilities introduced by people doing things the hands-on manual way. And if we move more towards automation and scripting, we have something that's more repeatable, scalable, and something that will hopefully be a more secure state at the end of it. So these are the 10 top risks for cloud computing that we came up with. But I think they're pointing back to the fundamentals of security that we've dealt with our entire career. And what I would like to use this as is a lesson for all of us, that no matter how new or shiny or crazily serverless our new technologies are, I think we will be served well by going back to the fundamentals of security and looking at ways to apply them in these new environments. And I think that is the true interesting challenge of security today and security in this field, is having that opportunity to apply good old sound principles to novel problem sets. And I applaud everybody here for coming to events like this and collaborating with your industry peers to figure out the best way to solve some of these problems. But again, I think it's all a matter of creative use of fundamentals here. So I think the move towards DevOps and cloud technologies, it's an opportunity. I think it's up to us to understand how to apply security there. I think we can make some of these traditional problems a lot better with the tool set that we're provided with. I think we have a unique responsibility to use our experience within security to help enable teams to do the right thing in this new wonderful world that we're dealing with. I'd also like to say that we have a responsibility to help people outside of our professional affiliations. We have a unique responsibility as security professionals to reach out to our communities and help them as well. I've had that rare opportunity with some political campaigns, but I would encourage everybody here to also think about their communities and where they might be able to spend their own career expertise in ways that may not actually work along with their career. Your neighborhood, your church, your civic organizations, any number of organizations could benefit from your experience in security, And I encourage everybody to see if you can help out in some way. And I think the real opportunity here is also being demonstrated by some of the folks we've heard from today. Slack is obviously doing amazing work in the cloud. We've got Netflix, we've got a bunch of other people. Riot Games gave a wonderful talk. And they've come out with a lot of great open source tools, and I just cherry picked ones that were on top of my mind. And this is more an example of things you can look at that are actually, I would say, commercial quality tools in many ways. Like, you would pay money for a lot of what these tools do for you, and they're being built by your partners in security. The industry is giving back, and I think that's a wonderful shift. And I think the ability, like, it's up to us to, one, take advantage of these kind of things and to build on top of them. SecurityMonkey is one of the more famous tools out of the Netflix security portfolio. Basically, it does monitoring of your account and does a lot of interesting alerting and workflows around those vulnerabilities. And it's been great that it's expanded recently to cover things like GitHub and other SaaS integrations. Riot Games Cloud Inquisitor is a similar tool that is looking for security issues within a configured account. Lots of interesting work to deal with things like domain hijacking and that kind of stuff. PackBot was recently released by T-Mobile. Again, it's looking to layer security into your environment. And StreamAlert is an amazing example of kind of serverless technologies for security and how it's much easier now to build something incredibly, that can handle an incredible volume and operate in massively parallel sense. They've implemented a version of this to do binary analysis, basically, through a Lambda-based workflow. And that is somewhat infinitely scalable. So there's a lot of great work out here. Again, these are just cherry-picked. But I would hope that people in the audience are interested in contributing to projects like this or developing your own. But I think the only important part of this is that we communicate with each other and we share what we learn. And we can work towards something that makes all of security within these environments better. So with that, that's all I had for you today. I'd love to answer any questions, or if you have any thoughts you'd like to share with the group, let me know.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben.
Thank you.